This is one of the most talked about pieces of backpacking gear over the last year, and I think you should avoid it. And it's not the only culprit. Today I'm going over 4 pieces of super hyped backpacking gear that I think you should avoid, but then also providing some recommendations for alternatives that you can consider. I know some of my thoughts in this video are going to be controversial, especially when we start talking about tents, so just know that these are my own opinions based on my own preferences and aren't kind of the be-all end-all when it comes to backpacking gear. So why does the Flextail Zero Pump suck? It's got a lot going for it. It's only 1.2 ounces or 56 grams with the battery. It's compact, rechargeable, and easy to use, but it has 2 big problems in my eyes. The first problem is that it only can achieve 0.37 PSI of pressure, and the reason that's an issue is because most sleeping pads out there need about 0.5 PSI in order to be fully inflated. When using the Zero Pump, I have to put extra breaths into the pad because it's just too underinflated when I'm just using the pump. The pad ends up being so underinflated that my hip is hitting the ground and I'm uncomfortable and I'm losing quite a bit of warmth from the sleeping pad because sleeping pads need to be fully inflated in order to maximize their warmth and R value. The second problem is that you need to take the battery out of the pump in order to recharge it, which leads to 3 separate pieces that are all easy to lose. I'd much rather see a charging port built right into the device. That being said, you can bring multiple batteries with you in order to keep the pump charged on longer trips. And Flextail did include a USB-C recharging port on the battery, so at least you don't need to be bringing a separate charger for the battery. You can just plug your USB-C cable directly into the battery. I also think it's silly that Flextail advertises the Zero Pump as being 1.2 ounces because that doesn't include the battery. That's just for the pump without a battery, and you're not running the pump without the battery. It's kind of a weird thing to put on the pump and advertise. There's 2 different alternatives that I think you should consider. The first one is the Flextail Tiny Pump X2. It weighs pretty much twice as much as the Zero Pump, which is still not very much, but what I like about it is that you have a built-in light on it, so you can hang this in your tent and get a little bit of extra light without having to use your headlamp, and then you also get a lot more PSI out of this. The Tiny Pump X2 can achieve 0.58 PSI of pressure, which gets it above that 0.5 kind of threshold and allows you to fully inflate most sleeping pads. The other option is just to use the inflation sack that comes with your sleeping pad. A lot of the time, you can get a sleeping pad fully inflated with just 4 breaths into the inflation sack, which is really efficient, is actually probably gonna take less time than using the pump, and you don't have to deal with that high-pitched noise that the pumps produce. The Zero Pump might be a great option for some people out there, but for trips where I'm trying to reduce weight as much as possible, I find myself just using my lungs or bringing an inflation sack with me, and then on trips where I'm not worried about weight quite as much, I'm just taking the Tiny Pump X2 because I'm able to get that full inflation and then have that lamp feature as well. This next piece of gear is something that I get asked about probably the most out of all the gear out there, and it's something that I've kind of held off on giving my definitive thoughts on because I had such high hopes for it. It's the Big Agnes Rapide SL. The new version that was released at the end of 2023 promised to be lighter weight and have a higher R value, all due to a new insulation technology. But that insulation technology didn't really live up to its promises and ends up being its downfall. While the previous version of the Rapide seemed to work well for people, I never got to try one. The new version has one big problem, and that's that it sleeps cold. For the new version, Big Agnes switched from a synthetic fill insulation to a reflective insulation, but it's not implemented as well as in other pads that use similar technology like with Thermarest, REI, and ZenBivy. The new Rapide has 2 problems with the insulation. The first problem with the insulation is that there's gaps in the insulation where the pad top connects to the pad bottom. And it creates kind of channels of cold and places where cold air can kind of move around the pad a little bit more and then cool you off. The second problem is that the reflective insulation isn't suspended in any way inside the pad, so it just falls to the bottom and then you lose a lot of its effectiveness and you have a lot of exposure to the sides and top of the pad, so if the air is cold around you, then you're gonna get really cold, and that also makes the insulation less effective at protecting you from the cold in the ground. I've tested the Rapide now in a bunch of different conditions, below freezing, at about freezing, and then above freezing on various kind of ground temperatures, and I found that it sleeps cold unless you're well above freezing on really warm ground. To me, that's unacceptable, even though the pad is still really comfortable. For how much it weighs, it should not be sleeping cold in those kind of conditions. If you want a lightweight but still pretty comfortable pad, then check out the Exped 5R. It sleeps warm down below freezing, is quite comfortable, and while bulky, is pretty lightweight as well. I'm pretty sad to have to talk about this piece of gear as something that I don't recommend anymore. It's the Defy satellite communicator, and it's compact, lightweight, and has really affordable plans. But there's one big reason that I can't recommend it anymore. And that's the fact that the original company who put out the Defy went out of business, and while the companies who provide the services for SOS and satellite communication messaging are still providing those services, the uncertainty around the device on how long those services are going to continue really makes it something that I would not want to rely on in the backcountry. So I find myself back to Garmin inReaches, and recently I've been reaching more and more for the inReach Messenger just because of the simplicity of the device and then the fact that it has really crazy battery life. The battery life on this is almost double what I got out of my inReach Mini 2 and doesn't really lose any functionality for stuff that I actually use. All right, it's time to talk about tents, and I'm gonna be picking on two brands in particular right now, Z-Packs and then Durston Gear. The tents that I'm gonna be talking about, I've never actually used before, and it's because I just really don't think they'd work for me that much that I don't even want to test them out. I'm willing to test out most gear out there, but I'm 99.99% sure that these tents I would just end up hating. The first one is the Z-Packs Offset Solo. I've used the Offset Trio and I think it's an amazing tent. You get a ton of space, it's extremely lightweight, and just an all-around great tent if you're looking for a spacious tent for couples and you're maybe bringing a dog with you or just want a ton of space inside the tent. When I'm backpacking solo, I want something that's simple, lightweight, and minimal. But with the Offset Solo, it is lightweight at 500 grams, but there's a lot more faffing about that you need to do with two trekking poles and then the butt pole. It's just more of a complicated tent than I think is needed for a one-person tent. I don't need two doors and two vestibules when I'm backpacking solo. It's just extra features that I think are unnecessary. And I'm also looking at you, Durston Gear, with the X-Mid 1 series of tents, the X-Mid 1 regular, the X-Mid 1 Pro. You get the two doors, two vestibules, and while sometimes that's advertised as a feature, I think it's just extra kind of faffing and extra stuff that's adding weight to the tent and a little bit more complexity for setting it up. That being said, I do really like that Z-Packs is trying new things, and I love the Offset Trio as a large tent. But once you're dropping down to those solo tents, I think you gotta be sticking with something that's a little bit less complex, like the Plex Solo from Z-Packs, or maybe something a little bit less expensive if it's not in your budget, like the 6 Moon Designs Lunar Solo. If you're looking for a little bit more space as a solo hiker, then I'd probably just go with the X-Mid Pro 2. It's gonna be a lightweight tent still. You're gonna have to deal with two trekking poles and then you have that extra vestibule and door, but you're gonna get a lot more space and it's still a fairly simple tent, especially relative to the Offset series. If you're interested what my go-to gear is for different kinds of trips, whether that's a desert trip, an ultralight trip, or a comfort trip, then check out my Pack Wizard page. I have all of my gear lists there, kind of out there for everyone to take a look at. Pack Wizard also has gear lists from a bunch of other people that you can take a look at and sort for different trails as well as activities. So it's a great resource if you're looking to get some inspiration when you're looking at gear and trying to put together your own gear list. Go check out this video if you want to see me testing all of the top rated gear from Pacific Crest Trail thru hikers. It's a bunch of gear that I've never used before, but I take it out on a pretty grueling trip. It ends up beating me up a little bit, and I realized some pretty interesting things about some gear that was new to me and that I've never tried before.